Hello and welcome to the Galeblade News. The US police officer accused of George Floyd's murder told him to stop talking as he repeatedly gasped under the man's knee, according to court documents. The unarmed black man cried out for his late mother and children as he said the Minneapolis policeman would kill him. Transcripts from body cam footage show. They were disclosed in court by lawyers for one of the four officers involved. The documents offer the clearest picture yet of Mr. Floyd's last moments. His death in May sparked global uproar. It led to a wave of anti-racism protests led by the Black Lives Matter movement and stirred debate and reflection in the US over the country's history of slavery and segregation. All four officers involved in taking Mr. Floyd into custody were fired and arrested. Derek Chauvin, who knelt on his neck, faces several charges including second-degree murder, while the other three, Thomas Lane, J. Alexander Kwong, and Toh Tao, are charged with aiding and abetting murder. The transcript were made public on Thursday as Mr. Lane's lawyers asked for the case against him to be dismissed. Until now, eyewitness footage shared on social media revealed most of what was known about Mr. Floyd's arrest and his final moments. The new transcripts give a more detailed account, shedding light on significant parts of the encounter from the time Mr. Lane and Mr. Kwong arrived at the scene to the point where Mr. Floyd was given CPR in an ambulance. Transcripts of footage recorded by body cameras fitted to Mr. Lane and Mr. Kwong show Mr. Floyd said more than 20 times he could not breathe as he was being restrained by officers in a Minneapolis street. They confronted him outside a convenience store where he was suspected of having used a forged $20 note to buy cigarettes. At one point, a handcuffed Mr. Floyd, while pinned down on the road next to the police car, gasps that he cannot breathe, adding, "You're going to kill me, man." Mr. Chauvin, who is shown in bystander footage, appearing to kneel on Mr. Floyd's neck for nearly 8 minutes, replies, "Then stop talking, stop yelling. It takes heck of a lot of oxygen to talk." The transcripts show Mr. Floyd appears cooperative at the beginning of the arrest, repeatedly apologizing to the officers after they approached his parked car. Mr. Lane asked Mr. Floyd to show his hands at least 10 times before ordering him to get out of the vehicle. In response to one of the demands to see his hands, Mr. Floyd says, "Man, I got shot the same way, Mr. Officer," before it is not clear what he is referring to. At one point, Mr. Lane says, "Why is he getting all squirrely and not showing us his hands and just being all weird like that?" The officers then handcuff Mr. Floyd and try to put him in the back of their police car. As they do, Mr. Floyd becomes agitated, repeatedly pleading that he is claustrophobic. Mr. Lane asks if he is on something. Mr. Floyd replies, "I'm scared, man." According to another document, Mr. Lane told investigators that once in the car, Mr. Floyd began thrashing back and forth. Officers then pulled him out of the car and then to the ground. Pinned on the floor, according to the transcript, Mr. Floyd cries out a dozen times, "Mama." He says, "Can't believe this, man. Mum, love you, love you. Tell my kids I love them. I'm dead." At one point, Mr. Floyd continues to plead he can't breathe. Mr. Lane asks Mr. Chauvin, "Should we roll him on his side?" The officer responds, "No, he's staying put where we got him." Mr. Chauvin's lawyers have not commented on the documents since they were made public. The transcripts were released in support of a legal bid to dismiss the criminal charges against Mr. Lane, a rookie officer who was days into the job when Mr. Floyd's death happened. Mr. Lane's lawyer, Earl Gray, who filed the documents, argued that it was not fair or reasonable for his client to stand trial on the charges. The new court documents include a transcript of Mr. Lane's interview with investigators from Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. In the interview, Mr. Lane talked through the first crucial moments of his encounter with Mr. Floyd. Mr. Lane said he pulled his gun out and ordered Mr. Floyd to show his hands after approaching his car and seeing him sitting with his hands down below the seat. Pictures from inside the car Mr. Floyd was sitting in before his arrest show 2 crumpled $20 bills that, according to Mr. Gray, were counterfeit. At the end of the interview, one of the investigators asked Mr. Lane if he felt either he or Mr. Chauvin had contributed to Mr. Floyd's death. "I object to that. You're not going to answer that," Mr. Gray said. The incident and the bystander videos that exposed it highlighted deep wounds over racial inequality in the US. For many, the outrage over Mr. Floyd's death also reflected years of frustration over socio-economic inequality and discrimination. Protests erupted and have continued since across many US cities and also internationally. Police forces, governments and businesses pledged reforms in recognition of the racial inequality that fueled the protests. Monuments of historical figures with links to the slavery in the US and other countries were reassessed. Some were toppled or vandalized, others were taken down by authorities and institutions. Mr. Floyd's death followed the high-profile cases of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Eric Garner in New York, and others that have been driven the Black Lives Matter movement in recent years. So here is a look at the US protest timeline. On the 25th of May 2020 was when George Floyd dies after the police arrest. George Floyd dies after being arrested by police outside the shop in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Footage shows a white officer, Derek Chauvin, kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck for several minutes while he is pinned down to the floor. Mr. Floyd is heard repeatedly say, "I can't breathe." He is pronounced dead later in hospital. And then we also have the ongoing process from the 26th of May. 4 officers involved in the arrest of George Floyd are fired. Protests begin as a video of the arrest is shared widely on social media. Hundreds of demonstrators take to the streets of Minneapolis and vandalize police cars and police station with graffiti. On the 27th of May, protests spread. Protests spread to other cities, including Memphis and Los Angeles. In some places like Portland, Oregon, protesters lie on the road chanting, "I can't breathe." Demonstrators again gather around the police station in Minneapolis, where the officers involved in George Floyd's arrest were based, and set fire to it. The building is evacuated and police retreat. On the 28th of May, Trump tweets, President Trump blames the violence on a lack of leadership in Minneapolis and threatens to send in the National Guard. In a tweet, he follows it up in a second tweet with a warning, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." The second tweet is hidden by Twitter for glorifying violence. On the 29th of May, CNN reporter Omar Jimenez is arrested while covering the Minneapolis protest. Mr. Jimenez was reporting live when police officers handcuffed him. A few minutes later, several of his colleagues are also arrested. They are all later released once they are confirmed to be members of the media. Derek Chauvin is charged with murder. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, 44, is charged with murder and manslaughter. The charge carries a combined maximum 35-year sentence. On the 31st of May, this is the sixth night of protests. Violence spreads across the US on the sixth night of protests. A total of at least 5 people are reported killed in protests from Indianapolis to Chicago. More than 75 cities have seen protests. At least 4,400 people have been arrested. Curfews are imposed across the US to try to stem the unrest. On the 1st of June, Trump threatens military response. President Trump threatens to send in the military to quell growing civil unrest. He says if cities and states fail to control the protests and defend their residents, he will deploy the army and quickly solve the problem for them. Mr. Trump poses in front of a damaged church shortly after police used tear gas to disperse peaceful protesters nearby. The 2nd of June is the 8th night of protests. Tens of thousands of protesters again take to the streets. One of the biggest protests is in George Floyd's hometown of Houston, Texas. Many defy curfews in several cities, but the demonstrations are largely peaceful. On the 4th of June, there is a memorial service for George Floyd, which is held in Minneapolis. Those gathered in tribute stand in silence for 8 minutes 46 seconds, the amount of time Mr. Floyd is alleged to have been on the ground under arrest. Hundreds attended the service, which heard a eulogy from civil rights activist Rev. Al Sharpton. On the 7th of June, international protests. As the US saw another weekend of protests, with tens of thousands marching in Washington, D.C., anti-racism demonstrations were held around the world. In Australia, there were major protests in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane that focused on the treatment of Indigenous Australians. There were also demonstrations in France, Germany, Spain and the UK. In Bristol, protesters tore down the statue of a 17th century slave trader and threw it into the harbour. On the 9th of June, there's a funeral service held for George Floyd, which was in his hometown of Houston. Just over 2 weeks after his death in Minneapolis and worldwide anti-racism protests, about 500 guests invited by the Floyd family are in attendance at the Fountain of Praise Church. Many more gather outside to show their support. So, what do you think of this? Do you think the additional footage will actually help this officer? I'd heard from the news that actually it wasn't just him. There was another officer who was also very junior in rank and had only been on shift for like 3 or 4 days as well. In that case, I don't see them getting the same level of they might get a manslaughter charge or some form of gross negligence charge as a reduced sentence. I don't think you could put him in the same level as this other officer who actually both took the action and was actually what I believe to be the training officer. So his decisions are more senior, and they were probably just obeying what he said, and they didn't know what else to do in the situation. Whatever you think, leave your comments down below. Like the video if you enjoy it, and don't forget to subscribe.